December 6th, 1941, Tokyo, Japan. A thin winter mist drifts above the imperial palace moat. The city glows under paper lanterns and muted lights as trains rattle past the darkened streets. In the naval ministry, doors close softly behind uniformed men who move with quiet urgency. Typewriters echo down the corridors. The air is calm, but it is stillness before a storm. What follows is the account of how Japan's secret plan to strike the American fleet at Pearl Harbor set off a chain of events that would awaken the United States and reshape the course of the war itself. Beneath the surface calm of this city lies a storm decades in the making, a collision between an empire reaching for survival and a superpower it believes it must strike before being strangled. What will unfold over the next 24 hours is not merely an attack, but the culmination of Japan's most daring plan, one meant to cripple American power in the Pacific and, in doing so, ignite the very response that would shape the rest of the war. By the end of 1941, Japan's empire stretched from Manchuria to the coast of China, a vast domain built on conquest and fueled by ambition. But with every victory, the empire's dependence on foreign resources grew more severe. Japan had no domestic oil, little iron, and few natural reserves. It was an industrial giant standing on a foundation of imported fuel. When the United States froze Japanese assets and cut off oil exports that summer, the lifeline of the empire was severed. The military warned that within 18 months, the Navy would be grounded, the army immobilized, and the empire defenseless. Within Japan's highest councils, the debate was not whether war was coming, but when, and on whose terms. Prime Minister Tojo Hideki, a man of stern discipline and fierce nationalism, faced the impossible task of preserving Japan's imperial ambitions while avoiding total isolation. Diplomats urged negotiation. Generals demanded action. The pressure from within the imperial general headquarters grew unbearable, one by one. Japan's leaders reached the same conclusion. To secure the empire's future, America's Pacific Fleet must be destroyed before it could act. From this logic was born the plan that would change the course of the 20th century. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, commander of the combined fleet, understood better than most what Japan was up against. He had lived in the United States, studied at Harvard, and had seen its vast industrial capacity firsthand. He knew the danger of awakening it. Yet, he also knew that Japan's window for success was closing. The empire's only chance lay in a single, decisive blow, a strike so sudden and overwhelming that it would paralyze American will long enough for Japan to seize the oil fields of Southeast Asia and fortify its newly conquered territories. Yamamoto's strategy was simple in design, but immense in risk. A carrier fleet would cross the North Pacific in complete radio silence, launch hundreds of aircraft against the U.S. Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor, and cripple it before America could react. Japan's survival would depend on hours, perhaps even minutes, of precision. On November 26, 1941, 6 carriers carrying over 350 planes slipped from Hitakapu Bay into the open sea. Every sailor aboard knew that their nation's fate now rode with them. The mission was cloaked in absolute secrecy. Even most of Japan's senior command did not know its details. As the ships advanced eastward, the distance between hope and disaster grew smaller. Mechanics adjusted torpedo fins for shallow waters. Armorers converted naval shells into makeshift bombs above the hum of machinery. One thought lingered in every mind, that this strike might secure Japan's place in the world, or doom it entirely. On the eve of December 7th, the fleet sailed beneath a moonless sky, no lights, no radio, only the faint hiss of wind and the low churn of propellers. In a few hours, the Empire of Japan would attempt the impossible, to rewrite the balance of power in the Pacific with one devastating strike, and in doing so, awaken a nation whose response would decide the fate of the world. In the months before December 1941, Japan stood at a crossroads between survival and ruin. The empire's lifeblood, oil, was draining away, and every strategy meeting inside the imperial palace began with the same grim calculation. How many months of fuel remained before the Navy could no longer sail? At the heart of Tokyo, in rooms heavy with cigarette smoke and silence, senior ministers gathered around maps of Asia. Red lines marked territories Japan already controlled: Manchuria, coastal China, French Indochina, But in the south, beyond those borders, lay the riches they desperately needed. The oil fields of the Dutch East Indies, the rubber of Malaya, the tin of Borneo. Conquering them would secure the empire for generations. Reaching them meant war with the West. The embargo imposed by the United States had turned Japan's economic problem into a countdown. American oil accounted for nearly 4/5 of the empire's supply. Without it, warships would remain tied to harbor, aircraft grounded, factories silenced. Civilian officials urged compromise, proposing withdrawal from China or partial concessions. But within the Imperial Army and Navy, such suggestions were treated as humiliation. For men raised under the Bushido spirit, that death was preferable to surrender. Retreat was worse than defeat. In private conferences, Prime Minister Hideki Tojo voiced what many feared to admit aloud. Japan could no longer rely on diplomacy. The empire's fate rested on a single decision: to fight a war it might not win rather than face a peace it could not endure. To the Japanese High Command, the blockade was not a policy. It was an act of strangulation across the Pacific. American policymakers viewed the situation differently. President Franklin Roosevelt and his advisors believed that economic pressure would force Japan to step back from aggression. Instead, it convinced Tokyo that time itself was the enemy. As autumn deepened, Japan's navy accelerated its preparations. Shipyards worked day and night refitting carriers. Pilots trained for long-range navigation across featureless ocean. Engineers modified torpedoes for shallow harbor depths. The plan that would strike Pearl Harbor began as a technical problem: how to make weapons behave differently than designed, and evolved into a national obsession. At sea, practice runs were conducted under absolute secrecy. Pilots learned to launch in pre-dawn darkness, to navigate by star and compass alone. Fleet signals were reduced to simple flags. Radio silence became law. The Imperial Navy's culture of precision turned every drill into ritual. Crews repeated tasks until timing became instinct. Because Yamamoto's design depended on minutes, not hours, of coordination. Inside Japan, the public knew none of this. Newspapers spoke of peace talks continuing in Washington. Citizens were told that relations with America were improving. But among officers, there was quiet understanding. Once the carriers departed, there would be no turning back. By late November, the breaking point had been reached. Fuel reserves were falling, negotiations stalled, and military impatience boiled into resolve. Admiral Yamamoto issued his final orders. The combined fleet would sail east under radio silence. If peace failed, the attack would proceed automatically. The empire had chosen its path. The next message sent to the fleet would determine whether Japan's future began with diplomacy or with war. December 1st, 1941, the Imperial Conference convenes in Tokyo, the highest council of state, where every major decision must receive the emperor's sanction behind the palace walls. 20 senior leaders sit beneath portraits of Meiji and Taisho emperors. Outside, the city goes about its ordinary business, unaware that within these walls, Japan is deciding whether to strike the United States. The atmosphere is tense but disciplined. Each man knows that history will remember this meeting. Foreign Minister Shigenori Togo argues that diplomacy is not yet exhausted. Others, like Army Chief Sugiyama and Navy Minister Nagano, insist that delay is suicide. Oil reserves, they remind the emperor, will reach critical levels by the following summer. Wait any longer, and Japan will be powerless to fight even a defensive war. The discussion stretches through the afternoon. Files are opened, figures read aloud, and at last the emperor himself speaks, softly, cautiously, asking whether every diplomatic option has truly been tried. It is a question that echoes duty, not doubt. The council bows their heads. The final decision is made. Japan will go to war if negotiations in Washington do not achieve peace by the set deadline. The order is given to prepare for operations against the United States, Britain, and the Netherlands. As the ministers leave, couriers rush through the corridors carrying sealed envelopes marked with a single word: top secret. Within hours, coded orders flash across naval channels to the fleet already steaming toward Hawaii. Admiral Nagumo's carrier force, positioned north of the Pacific trade routes, receives the message: climb Mount Niitaka 1208. It is the signal to attack on December 8th, Tokyo time. December 7th, in Hawaii. In the war room aboard the flagship Akagi, officers unfold maps of Oahu. Markers indicate targets: Battleship Row, airfields at Wheeler and Hickam, fuel depots, communication stations. Pilots review briefing sheets printed with photographs from earlier reconnaissance flights. The plan demands silence, speed, and surprise. Back in Tokyo, diplomats continue their delicate performance. They meet with American officials, presenting new proposals that promise little change but preserve the illusion of progress. Japanese code clerks labor through the night to translate a final message, a 14-part memorandum meant to sever relations before the attack begins. Time runs short. Transmission errors and delays will ensure it arrives too late. For those within Japan's command, there is no illusion. They know what the next dawn will bring. The operation they have crafted in secrecy for months is now set in motion. Failure means annihilation. Success, they believe, might buy the Empire a chance to survive on its own terms. In the cold Pacific darkness, 6 carriers press forward through wind and rain. On deck, aircraft are checked and secured. Pilots sleep in cramped quarters, unaware that history has narrowed to these final days. Far behind them, in offices and bunkers across Tokyo, the last radio messages are sent and silence falls. The storm that Japan has built is now beyond recall. In less than a week, it will reach Pearl Harbor, and the world will never be the same. The plan was called Operation Z, a codename that concealed one of the most audacious military gambles in history. Conceived by Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, it was built on logic as cold as it was bold. Japan could not win a long war against the United States, so it must win a short one. At its core lay a single belief, that America, stunned by a devastating opening strike, would choose negotiation over prolonged conflict. If Japan could destroy the U.S. Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor, it would buy 6 months to a year of freedom in which to seize the resource-rich colonies of Southeast Asia and fortify them against counterattack. But Yamamoto's strategy carried risks few dared to voice. It required flawless coordination across thousands of miles, perfect secrecy and total surprise. It demanded precision that left no room for error. Above all, it assumed that the United States, once wounded, would recoil rather than retaliate. In late October 1941, Yamamoto summoned his carrier commanders to his flagship Nagato at Hashirajima. The meeting was brief but decisive. Charts were spread, models arranged, and the admiral outlined the plan that would alter history. 6 carriers would advance in a northern arc across the Pacific. Hidden by winter storms and distant shipping routes, they would launch more than 350 aircraft at dawn against targets across Oahu. Battleships, airfields, and fuel depots. The fleet would then retreat northward before the enemy could locate them. In theory, it was perfect. In practice, it was terrifying. The Imperial Navy had never before attempted a strike of this scale. Fuel range was calculated to the gallon, timing to the minute. Navigation across the vast Pacific meant trusting only compass, stars, and silence. Each unit commander understood what failure would mean. Not just the loss of ships, but the collapse of Japan's strategic future. Yamamoto himself understood the paradox of his plan. A tactician by training and a realist by nature, he knew America's industrial strength far surpassed Japan's. He hoped to achieve a political victory through a military one, to shock the United States into accepting Japanese dominance in Asia. But privately, he feared the opposite, that the blow meant to preserve the empire would instead seal its destruction. In Tokyo, war planners finalized every detail. Code names were assigned. Nitaka Yama Nobore, climb Mount Nitaka, would signal the attack order. Submarines were positioned around Hawaii to intercept fleeing ships. Weather forecasts were checked daily. Every possible contingency was measured. Calculated, rehearsed, as December approached, diplomatic efforts in Washington continued only as theater. Japan's envoys spoke of peace even as their superiors prepared for war. The Imperial Navy's carriers gathered quietly in Hitokapu Bay, the northernmost anchorage in the Kuril Islands. Shrouded in fog and secrecy, on November 26th, the first air fleet departed, 6 carriers, 2 battleships, 3 cruisers, and 11 destroyers, the most powerful strike group in Japanese history. Its course was set across the empty North Pacific, where no commercial lanes existed and where discovery was least likely. The operation depended on surprise and on luck. Storm fronts shielded the fleet through early December, No American patrol planes ventured that far north. No merchant ships sighted the formation. Day by day, the fleet advanced, cutting through freezing waters toward Hawaii. By December 2nd, the message arrived from Tokyo. Negotiations had failed. The Imperial Council had approved war against the United States, Britain, and the Netherlands. That night, under a moonless sky, Admiral Chuichi Nagumo gathered his senior officers aboard Akagi. The final order was read. Attack on the morning of December 8th, Tokyo time. The men saluted in silence. Outside, snow fell lightly across the decks, engines rumbled to life, and the fleet turned southeast toward its target. In less than a week, Japan's fate and America's awakening would be decided. 5,000 miles northeast of Tokyo, the Pacific stretches endlessly in every direction. A cold, steel-gray sea beneath a pale winter sky on the horizon. 6 carriers cut a narrow line across the waves. Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu, Shokaku, and Zuikaku together, they formed the Kido Butai, the most powerful carrier force the world has ever seen. For 12 days they have traveled through open ocean in complete silence. No radio messages, no lights on deck, only the rhythmic pulse of engines and the faint whistle of wind across the bow. Even among the crew, conversation has dwindled. Everyone aboard understands the weight of secrecy. Discovery now would mean catastrophe. In the pre-dawn chill, pilots rise from narrow bunks. Wrapping themselves in flight suits stiff from sea air, mechanics line the decks, fueling aircraft and adjusting torpedo fins designed to skim the shallow waters of Pearl Harbor. Armorers fit modified bombs, 800-kilogram shells engineered to pierce the armored decks of American battleships. Every movement is timed to the second. Every word reduced to necessity. Commander Mitsuo Fuchida, who will lead the first attack wave, walks the length of the flight deck, clipboard in hand. Around him, the deck hums with controlled energy. 1,000 men united in quiet precision. The plan they have rehearsed for months has been reduced to one simple moment. Dawn. On December 6th, Admiral Nagumo calls a final meeting of his senior officers aboard Akagi. The weather is favorable, the fleet undetected, and the signal from Tokyo has arrived. The time for hesitation is over. The order is confirmed. Attack Pearl Harbor at dawn, December 7th. As night falls, a few officers gather briefly on deck. The ocean is calm, the stars sharp and cold. One man mutters that the sea seems too peaceful for what is coming. Another replies softly, "The quieter the sea, the louder the storm." Hours later, a coded message crackles through the air from Tokyo. The last diplomatic note has been delivered in Washington. It makes no mention of an attack. The fleet's final course adjustment is made. Distance to target, 230 miles, just before dawn on December 7th. The first wave begins to launch. The engines roar in sequence, slicing through the morning stillness. Fighters rise first, followed by bombers and torpedo planes, climbing into the dark sky toward the faint glow on the horizon. Below, sailors pause in their duties, watching the silhouettes vanish into the distance. On his flagship, Nagumo stares east, expression unreadable. He knows the risk. Japan's entire naval future rests on these 6 carriers. If the Americans find them before the planes return, the Empire will lose its only offensive weapon. But hesitation would mean worse. The loss of Japan's chance to survive, as the planes disappear over the Pacific. Radio silence continues. The fleet turns slightly north. Waiting in the shadows, above the waves, 183 aircraft race toward Hawaii. The sun begins to rise behind them. Below those same skies, in the distant Hawaiian Islands, Sunday morning has begun like any other. Church bells ring, families prepare breakfast. Sailors on battleships clean decks or line up for inspection. No alarms, no warnings. Only the faint hum of engines far above the clouds. The sound of history approaching. The storm Japan has built in secrecy for years is now seconds from breaking. The first light of dawn touches the peaks of Oahu, at Wheeler Field. American airmen begin their morning routines, fueling aircraft, chatting idly, unaware that they are already being watched. At 7:49 a.m., Commander Fuchida's voice crackles over radio. "Tora! Tora! Tora!" The coded signal that complete surprise has been achieved. In the next instant, the quiet Hawaiian morning explodes. From the skies above the Kulau Mountains, Japanese bombers descend in formation, sunlight glinting off their wings. The first torpedoes streak low across the harbor, their wakes slicing through still water toward the battleships moored along Ford Island. Seconds later, the first detonations ripple across the harbor, thunder rolling through the valley as USS Arizona, Oklahoma, and West Virginia take the first blows. On board the American ships, chaos erupts. Sailors are thrown from bunks as shockwaves tear through steel hulls. Some rush to anti-aircraft guns. Others dive into oily water to escape flames spreading across the decks. At the naval airfields, Japanese Zero fighters rake the ground with machine gun fire, destroying rows of planes before they can take off. Within minutes, America's Pacific Fleet, once thought untouchable, is engulfed in fire. For the Japanese pilots, the view below is both triumphant and terrible. Bombs strike precisely where months of reconnaissance predicted. Battleships lift from the water as explosions tear through them. The harbor becomes a boiling mass of smoke, flame and debris. Yet amid the destruction, the pilots also see faces, sailors fighting the flames, men swimming through burning oil, a few standing their ground behind still functioning guns. It is victory, but it is not glorious. At 8:10 a.m., a single armor-piercing bomb plunges through the forward deck of USS Arizona. Detonating in the magazine below, the explosion shatters the ship in two, killing over 1,000 men instantly. The blast sends a column of fire hundreds of feet into the air, the image that will define the day forever. Within 90 minutes, the attack is over. 2 waves, 353 planes, 18 American ships damaged or destroyed, more than 2,400 people killed, another 1,200 wounded. The Pacific Fleet lies crippled, its battleships resting in the shallow mud of the harbor. The Japanese losses, 29 aircraft, 5 midget submarines and 64 men for Admiral Nagumo. The figures mark success, greater than anyone dared imagine. Yet even as his fleet turns homeward, not everyone on board shares the same conviction. Some officers urge a third wave to destroy Pearl Harbor's vital fuel depots and repair yards. Nagumo refuses, fearing that lingering too long could expose the carriers to counterattack. The fleet retreats toward Japan, mission complete, at least in their eyes. Back on Oahu, the sky turns gray with smoke. Hospitals overflow. Civilians and soldiers work side by side to rescue the trapped, extinguish fires, and tend to the wounded. Amid the wreckage, the harbor's waters churn with oil and flame, a vision of hell beneath the tropical sun. That night, radio stations across the Pacific broadcast the news. The world learns that Japan has struck first. Without warning, before any declaration of war, what Japan saw as a calculated blow for survival, America perceives as betrayal in Tokyo. The attack is celebrated as divine success, a triumph of planning and courage. But for the United States, it is something far greater, a call to arms. Across the Pacific, a sleeping giant has been awakened. By mid-morning on December 7th, 1941, Pearl Harbor had become an inferno. The once calm waters of the naval base were unrecognizable, a floating wasteland of twisted metal, oil, and flame. The acrid smell of burning fuel and scorched paint hung thick in the air, mixing with smoke that turned the tropical sunlight into a dim orange haze. Everywhere, men fought for survival. Some clung to debris as burning oil spread across the water's surface, igniting around them like liquid fire. Others worked shoulder to shoulder, forming human chains to pass ammunition to the few guns still firing. Fireboats sprayed torrents of water over the listing hulls, while medical corpsmen transformed the decks of surviving ships into makeshift hospitals. The USS Oklahoma had capsized completely, trapping hundreds of sailors inside. Rescue teams hammered frantically on its overturned hull, answering desperate tapping from within. Nearby, West Virginia burned from stem to stern, her decks awash in fuel. The air was filled with the constant crackle of flames and the muffled cries of men trapped below. The USS Arizona remained the center of horror. Its remains still smoldered. The great ship consumed by an explosion so violent that it lifted her entire superstructure out of the water. Oil from her ruptured tanks spread across the harbor, feeding fires that burned for 2 full days. Out of a crew of more than 1,400, only a few hundred survived. The rest, entombed within the shattered hull, would remain there forever. Yet amid the devastation, acts of heroism unfolded everywhere. on USS California, sailors manually loaded shells into guns until the deck beneath them began to give way. On Nevada, the only battleship to get underway during the attack, crewmen fought to steer her clear of the harbor mouth even as bombs struck her bow. When she finally ran aground to avoid sinking and blocking the channel, the crew abandoned ship under continuous fire at Hickam Field, where Japanese Zeros had strafed planes parked wingtip to wingtip. The runways were littered with wreckage, yet airmen worked through smoke and falling debris to pull comrades from burning hangars. Civilians joined the rescue effort. Doctors, dock workers, even school teachers transforming hospitals, churches and warehouses into emergency wards. By noon, the attack was over, but the chaos was not. The harbor continued to burn. The once proud Pacific Fleet, centerpiece of American deterrence in the Pacific, now lay silent and motionless, its great ships reduced to ruins. In the hours that followed, military commanders worked feverishly to assess the damage. Admiral Kimmel, commander of the Pacific Fleet, stood on the steps of his headquarters, staring across the harbor in disbelief. Reports arrived too quickly to process. 8 battleships damaged or destroyed, nearly 200 aircraft lost, more than 2,400 dead. The numbers were staggering, but the deeper shock came from realization that this had happened not in battle, but in peace. As night fell over Oahu, the fires still glowed against the dark sky. Searchlights swept across the harbor, illuminating the wreckage of ships that had once symbolized American power. For survivors, exhaustion replaced fear. For the dead, the sea itself had become their grave. And yet, in the ashes of Pearl Harbor, something irreversible had begun to form, a unity of purpose. Born in shock, tempered in rage, while smoke still drifted above Hawaii, Japan's leaders in Tokyo received the first coded reports from the fleet. The transmission was short, calm, and triumphant. Tora, Tora, Tora. Success beyond expectation. The Imperial General Headquarters erupted in celebration. Officers bowed to each other, exchanging quiet smiles. Newspapers rushed to print headlines declaring victory in the Pacific. To many in Japan, the news was cause for national pride. After years of Western embargoes and political humiliation, the empire had struck decisively against one of the world's greatest powers, and won. Radio broadcasts framed the attack as a defensive act, a response forced upon Japan by American encirclement. Crowds gathered outside government buildings, cheering the emperor and the navy. The phrase, "the spirit of Yamato," spread quickly, a symbol of divine destiny fulfilled. But not everyone in Japan shared the celebration. Among the senior officers who understood America's vast potential, there was unease. Admiral Yamamoto, still aboard his flagship in the inland sea, read the preliminary reports in silence. His attack had achieved perfection. The fleet at Pearl Harbor was crippled, the U.S. battleship force temporarily destroyed. Yet he also knew what these results meant. In striking so successfully, Japan had guaranteed that there would be no return to negotiation. As the empire rejoiced, Yamamoto reportedly turned to an aide and said quietly, "We have awakened a sleeping giant and filled him with a terrible resolve." Whether he spoke those exact words or not, the sentiment was real. Yamamoto understood America, its people, its resources, its industrial depth. Japan had won a stunning tactical victory, but one that defied strategic logic across the Pacific. The echo of that victory was immediate and electric. In Washington, it arrived as disbelief, then fury. President Franklin D. Roosevelt learned of the attack in the early afternoon. As reports confirmed the scale of destruction, the room fell silent. For months, he had sought to contain Japan through diplomacy, but now that restraint was over, within hours, his staff began drafting a message to Congress, a declaration that would mark December 7th as a date which will live in infamy. Across the United States, news bulletins interrupted regular broadcasts. Families gathered around radios, their faces pale with shock. In small towns and cities alike, enlistment offices filled overnight. Lines formed outside recruiting stations that wrapped around blocks. Mechanics, students, farmers, and clerks all volunteered within days. The nation had transformed from isolation to mobilization for the Japanese government. The first phase of its grand strategy had succeeded beyond expectation, but in achieving it, they had awakened something they could not control. America's industrial capacity, vast, untapped, and relentless, would now turn its full attention toward war. In the weeks to come, Japan's flags would rise over Guam. Hong Kong, the Philippines, and Malaya, victories would come quickly, feeding the illusion that the empire's destiny was unstoppable. But beneath those early triumphs, the echo of Pearl Harbor grew louder, a warning carried across the Pacific. The attack that was meant to secure Japan's future had instead ensured a far greater conflict. And as both nations looked toward an uncertain horizon, neither could yet imagine how the war they had begun that morning would end. In fire, surrender, and transformation. The morning after Pearl Harbor, the world had changed across the Pacific. The smoke still hung over Oahu. But the political horizon had already shifted. At noon on December 8th, 1941, President Franklin D. Roosevelt walked slowly to the podium in the U.S. Capitol. His face was solemn, his voice steady, his words unforgettable. Yesterday, December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy. Those 29 words transformed grief into resolve. Within minutes, the Senate voted unanimously for war. The House followed almost as quickly. The United States, a nation long divided between isolation and intervention, was united by outrage. The giant Japan had hoped to paralyze was now fully awake. For Japan, the early months of war unfolded exactly as Yamamoto had predicted. 6 months of rapid conquest. The rising sun advanced across the Pacific like wildfire. American and British bases fell one by one. Hong Kong surrendered by Christmas. Wake Island, after a desperate defense, was overrun. The Philippines became a siege, the fortress at Corregidor enduring months of bombardment before surrendering in May in Southeast Asia. Japanese forces swept through Malaya, Burma, and the Dutch East Indies with astonishing speed. The Imperial Army's tactics, fast-moving infantry supported by air power, overwhelmed ill-prepared colonial defenses. By spring 1942, Japan controlled a territory stretching from the border of India to the Solomon Islands. From the Aleutians in the north to New Guinea in the south, it was an empire that spanned nearly 1/6 of the planet's surface. At home, Japanese radio broadcast triumph after triumph. The attack on Pearl Harbor was hailed as divine victory, proof that Japan's destiny was protected by the gods. But inside the upper command, Yamamoto and his senior staff understood the truth. The victories were borrowed time. America's industrial response had already begun, and it was unlike anything the world had ever seen in Detroit. Factories that once built cars now turned out tanks, jeeps, and aircraft engines. Ford's massive Willow Run plant, built in record time, produced a new B-24 Liberator bomber every hour by the end of the war. Across the Midwest, women replaced men on assembly lines, operating lathes and riveting aircraft fuselages. Their hands built the arsenal that would soon reverse Japan's fortunes. American shipyards working around the clock launched Liberty ships faster than Japan's submarines could sink them. By 1943, the United States was producing more steel, oil, and aircraft than all the Axis powers combined. Japan had awakened a nation that measured its power not in rhetoric or heritage, but in sheer industrial arithmetic. Still, in the first months of 1942, the Imperial Navy remained supreme. Its carriers struck across the Pacific, seizing Guam, the Gilberts, the Solomons, and New Guinea. The world's oceans, once ruled by the Western powers, now belonged to Japan. The West's prestige in Asia seemed shattered beyond repair, but every advance carried within it a fatal flaw. Overextension. Japan's supply lines stretched thousands of miles, its fuel reserves dwindled, and its merchant fleet was too small to sustain a prolonged war. American cryptanalysts, working in secret in Hawaii and Australia, had already begun to pierce the Japanese naval code known as JN-25. For the first time, the advantage of surprise was shifting. The first blow came in April 1942. 16 American B-25 bombers, launched from the carrier USS Hornet, roared over Tokyo in the Doolittle raid, a daring strike that inflicted little physical damage but immense psychological impact. Japan's home islands, once thought untouchable, had been breached. The raid forced Japanese leaders to confront an unsettling truth. America would not negotiate. It would fight to the end. In May, the Battle of the Coral Sea halted Japan's advance toward Australia. It was the first naval battle fought entirely by aircraft, with opposing fleets never sighting one another. Both sides suffered heavy losses, but strategically, Japan failed to achieve its goal a month later. The empire made its greatest gamble yet, the invasion of Midway Island, a tiny atoll northwest of Hawaii. Yamamoto hoped to lure what remained of the U.S. Pacific Fleet into a trap and finish what Pearl Harbor had begun. But thanks to American codebreakers, Admiral Chester Nimitz knew Japan's plan before it unfolded. On June 4, 1942, U.S. carrier aircraft caught the Japanese strike force by surprise in the span of 5 minutes. Dive bombers from Enterprise and Yorktown turned the tide of the Pacific War. 3 Japanese carriers, Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu, were engulfed in flames. A 4th, Hiryu, followed by nightfall. The Kido Butai, once invincible, was gone. More than 300 Japanese aircraft and hundreds of irreplaceable pilots were lost. Midway was not just a battle. It was the collapse of Japan's offensive power. From that point forward, Japan would fight on defense, against an enemy whose strength only grew with time. For the Americans, the victory at Midway was redemption for Japan. It was the beginning of the long retreat. Yamamoto, who had orchestrated the empire's rise, now watched its decline. He knew that the arithmetic of war, fuel, ships, factories, had turned decisively against Japan, yet still the empire fought on, the Bushido spirit. The code of loyalty and sacrifice would carry Japan through years of hardship, but beneath the surface, the truth was already clear. The sleeping giant had awakened, and he was marching east. By late 1942, the war in the Pacific had entered a new phase. Japan's rapid expansion had reached its limits. The empire that once seemed unstoppable now faced a relentless counteroffensive, one fueled by America's vast production and united will. The turning point came in the Solomon Islands, at a place few Americans had heard of before the war, Guadalcanal. In August 1942, U.S. Marines landed on its jungle shores, seizing an unfinished Japanese airfield. What followed was 6 months of brutal fighting by land. Sea and air, Japanese soldiers fought with unmatched ferocity, launching night attacks that ended in hand-to-hand combat. The terrain was unforgiving, disease rampant, and supplies scarce. But by February 1943, Japan's forces withdrew. It was their first major defeat on land, and a harbinger of what was to come. Meanwhile, American industry unleashed an avalanche of material. New Essex-class carriers joined the fleet, each capable of launching dozens of aircraft. Advanced radar and improved tactics gave U.S. commanders an edge Japan could no longer match. The balance of power had shifted permanently by 1944. The Pacific had become a vast battlefield stretching thousands of miles, island by island. The United States advanced through the Central and Southwest Pacific in a strategy of island hopping. Each captured island became a forward base for bombers and fleets moving ever closer to Japan. The cost was staggering. Tarawa, Saipan, Leyte, Iwo Jima, names etched forever into memory. In Tokyo, the initial euphoria of victory had long since faded. Factories struggled under shortages, fuel rations grew dire, and the once proud fleet was dwindling. American submarines, silent, efficient, merciless, sank Japanese merchant ships faster than they could be replaced. By 1945, Japan's economy was strangled, its navy crippled, its skies filled with enemy bombers. The response from Japan's military leadership was not surrender, but defiance. New strategies were devised, kamikaze attacks, suicide submarines, last stands. Each reflected a nation refusing to yield even as defeat became inevitable. The Bushido Code, once a symbol of discipline and honor, had transformed into a doctrine of self-destruction. Across the Pacific, the United States prepared for the final act. General Douglas MacArthur advanced through the Philippines, fulfilling his promise to return. Admiral Nimitz's fleets closed on Japan from the Central Pacific. By the summer of 1945, the Allied forces had reached Okinawa, less than 400 miles from the Japanese mainland. The battle for Okinawa became one of the bloodiest of the war. Over 12,000 Americans and more than 100,000 Japanese soldiers and civilians died. Entire towns were obliterated. The skies above were filled with kamikaze aircraft crashing into ships in waves of fire. Japan's defense was desperate but unbroken. Yet even as soldiers fought and died, a new kind of weapon was being prepared, one that would render all traditional notions of war obsolete. On August 6, 1945, the American bomber Enola Gay dropped the first atomic bomb on Hiroshima. 3 days later, Nagasaki followed in moments. 2 cities were reduced to ash. More than 100,000 lives were lost instantly. Thousands more would die from burns and radiation. In Tokyo, the emperor broke centuries of silence. For the first time, the voice of a Japanese monarch was heard by his people. On August 15, 1945, Hirohito announced Japan's surrender. His words were measured and mournful. "We have resolved to endure the unendurable and suffer what is insufferable." The war that began with fire at Pearl Harbor ended with fire over Hiroshima. The circle had closed. In the ruins, Japan faced the reality that its empire, the dream of dominion across Asia and the Pacific, was gone. Cities lay in ashes, millions were displaced, yet from that devastation emerged something remarkable: renewal. Under American occupation, Japan rebuilt itself into a modern democracy. The same discipline that once fueled conquest now fueled recovery. For the United States, the victory marked its emergence as a global superpower, a nation whose industrial, military, and technological might had reshaped the world order. The Pacific, once dominated by empires, became the stage of a new era, one defined not by conquest, but by reconstruction and alliance. The story that began in the quiet corridors of Tokyo in 1941, a plan forged in secrecy and desperation, had come full circle. Japan's attempt to cripple America had instead awakened it. The strike that was meant to secure an empire had destroyed it. In the end, Pearl Harbor was not just a battle. It was the hinge of history, the moment when one empire reached too far, and another rose to dominate a century, and as the fires of war faded into memory, the echoes of that morning, the rising sun over Oahu, the smoke over Battleship Row, the silence after the storm remained as a warning written across time, that in war, as in fate, no plan survives the power it awakens.